Roosevelt during this period. They viewed him as a traitor to his class. Some called him a socialist who was out to strip wealthy people of their money. But Roosevelt was not one to shrink from political combat. In the speech at Madison Square Garden in October of 1936, he referred to his bitter political enemies when he declared, quote, "They are unanimous in their hatred for me, and I welcome their hatred." And the popularity of the Second New Deal can be seen in Roosevelt's overwhelming victory in the 1936 presidential election. He won the electoral vote by a margin of 523 to just 8 for his Republican opponent, Alf Landon. It was the most lopsided victory since James Madison's win over John Quincy Adams in 1820. And as you can see from this map, Roosevelt carried all but 2 states, Vermont and Maine. But in his second term as president, Roosevelt had to deal with many troubling issues. Labor strikes, he had to deal with particularly the attempt to unionize auto workers in the Ford and General Motors plants. And in 1937, workers at the General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan, resorted to a new type of strike in their demands for a shorter work week and higher wages. It was called a sit-down strike. So instead of going out and picketing, they stayed in the factory, but they refused to work. And then workers struck at the Republic Steel Company of Chicago on Memorial Day in 1937. And that strike resulted in violence as police beat picketers on the strike line. Now, Roosevelt knew he would be damned whichever side he chose, labor or management. So in this struggle, Roosevelt quoted a line from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. He said, "To both labor and management, a plague on both your houses." Now, by 1937, this conservative-dominated Supreme Court had struck down many New Deal programs. They declared the Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional. They declared the National Recovery Act unconstitutional. And so Roosevelt was very upset with this conservative-dominated Supreme Court. And so here's a cartoon of Roosevelt in a rowboat that's labeled National Recovery. But Uncle Sam is in the water, and the water is labeled Depression. And the caption reads, Roosevelt says to Uncle Sam, "I'm sorry, but the Supreme Court says I must chuck you out again." In other words, that the Supreme Court is undermining his program for national recovery. Now, of the 9 justices, 6 were over the age of 70. In fact, the average age for all 9 was 71 at the time. And so Roosevelt came up with a plan whereby he wanted to appoint an additional Supreme Court judge for every sitting judge over the age of 70. So in other words, since 6 of the 9 judges were over the age of 70, he wanted to appoint 6 additional judges, which would have brought the number up to 15. Now, there's nothing sacrosanct about a 9-justice Supreme Court. In fact, the number of judges has varied in American history from a low of 6 to a high of 10. But critics charged that Roosevelt was interfering with separation of powers by wanting to appoint 6 new justices, and that would give the executive branch undue influence over the judiciary. And so his program was ridiculed as a court-packing plan. And this cartoon shows the old nine as a baseball player, and he's sitting on the bench. And of course, that's a double entendre. The bench is a baseball expression, but it's also a Supreme Court expression. Now, Roosevelt's plan was, in the end, rejected because public opinion was very much against what Roosevelt was trying to do. And so this cartoon shows what many people felt, that Roosevelt was trying to suppress and control the Supreme Court. Now, this has contemporary relevance because if Donald Trump does appoint a conservative to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg, then that would leave the Supreme Court with 6 conservatives and 3 liberals. If the Democrats win the November election, if Biden is elected, and if the Democrats win the Senate, then there is the possibility that the Senate could increase the number of judges on the Supreme Court to allow Biden to appoint 3 or maybe even 4 justices, the way Roosevelt tried in 1936 or 1937. Well, although Roosevelt's plan was rejected, one of the justices got the message. His name was Owen Roberts, not related to the Chief Justice Roberts today, but Owen Roberts he was a conservative, but after Roosevelt floated his court-packing plan, Roberts realized that maybe the Supreme Court was in some danger. And so he began voting with liberals. And so instead of the court striking down New Deal programs by a 5-4 majority, now the Supreme Court was upholding New Deal legislation by a 5-4 majority. So someone said that Justice Owen Roberts, by switching from conservative to liberal, that was the switch in time that saved 9, meaning the 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Now, having won the 1936 presidential election by the biggest margin up to that time, it seemed that everything was going well with Roosevelt and the New Deal. In 1937, the president, in fact, believed that the nation had recovered its economic health. And he tried to then balance the federal budget by cutting back on federal expenditures. And so, for example, he reduced the funding for the WPA by half. But by cutting federal funding, it proved disastrous for the American economy. Because as a result of such cuts, unemployment rose by 1.5 million by July 1937. So if we look at this chart here, we can see that when Roosevelt was elected in 1933, there were almost 13 million unemployed, but the number of unemployed fell steadily until 1936. And this is when Roosevelt started cutting federal spending. But you can see the impact. Unemployment then rose again to about 10.4 million. And with farm subsidies cut, farm prices fell. And so by August, an additional 4 million Americans were out of work. And so the economy would not fully recover from this recession until the United States entered World War II. So this recession of 1937 is called the Roosevelt Recession. Now, the reasons why the country went back into recession is largely because Roosevelt didn't have a really firm grasp of economics. He had abandoned New Deal policies in order to balance the federal budget. But balancing the federal budget meant cutting government spending. And by cutting government spending, that only increased unemployment. Now, by 1939 and 1940, the New Deal was no longer Roosevelt's top priority. With fascist aggression on the rise in Europe and in Japan, Roosevelt became more concerned with military preparedness. It was the United States' entry into World War II that really ended the Depression, as we will see. Now, before we turn to foreign policy, I want to talk a little about critics of the New Deal. In recent years, there's been a spate of books critical of Roosevelt's approach in trying to solve the Depression. These books include Jim Powell's FDR'S Folly, How Roosevelt and His New Deal Prolonged the Great Depression, Amity Schlei's The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, and Bert Folsom's New Deal or Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Had Damaged America. Now, economic historians and right-wing commentators blame the New Deal for prolonging the Depression by deterring private investment through excessive government regulation and by raising wages. Now, New Deal programs, they claim, were responsible for the high unemployment during the 1930s because they claim it made it expensive for employers to hire people because wages were raised and because taxes were tripled during the 1930s. And all of that discouraged private investment, which led to higher unemployment, say these conservative critics. They also say that Roosevelt didn't do anything to help banks diversify their loan portfolios, and that was the cause of most of the bank failures. They also referred to federal subsidies that they claim stifled the economy, such as subsidies to farmers, minimum wage, work projects. They all encouraged decreased productivity, which exacerbated unemployment. They also say that Roosevelt forced wage rates above market levels, and that in the end destroyed thousands of jobs because employers couldn't afford to pay higher wages. They're very critical of Roosevelt's Agricultural Adjustment Act, which raised the price of farm goods by getting farmers to destroy crops. It also displaced sharecroppers and tenant farmers, most of whom were Black. Conservative critics say that deficit spending really didn't work, that despite massive government spending on public work projects, unemployment remained high through the 1930s. And finally, they complained that FDR assumed unprecedented arbitrary power. During his 13 years as president, he issued 3,728 executive orders, more than all other presidents from Truman to Clinton combined. Now, I think some of these criticisms are valid. Roosevelt certainly did expand executive powers, and it is true that the New Deal never solved the problem of unemployment. However, when you talk about deficit spending, yes, the government did go in the red during the 1930s, but it's nothing compared to the deficit spending that followed, as you can see on this chart. So this represents the billions of dollars in deficits. So during 1935, it was about $2.5 billion in deficit. And by 1940, it rose to about $2.7 billion. And of course, World War II created much more deficit spending. And so the United States was in debt to $48 billion by 1945. But let's compare the deficit spending from 1975 through 1991. So as you can see, by 1991, the United States owed $268 billion compared to just $48 billion at the end of the Roosevelt administration. Now, while it is true that Roosevelt did not secure recovery until World War II broke out, it's also true that government spending did reduce unemployment. It didn't solve the problem of unemployment, but it certainly reduced it. And it's difficult to see that a free market solution without deficit spending would have achieved a reduction in unemployment. So now let's look at the legacy of Roosevelt's New Deal. As we mentioned, it resulted in an expansion of the power of the federal government. The New Deal established the principle that it was the government's responsibility to maintain the economic health of the nation. Now, that wasn't always the case. Before the New Deal, the dominant philosophy was laissez-faire, that the government should keep its hands off of the economy. But with the New Deal, the principle was established that it's the government responsibility to take active measures to restore vitality to the economy, and that the government is responsible for assisting the less fortunate in society. That was the major legacy of the New Deal. Another legacy is deficit spending. The government never spent more than it took in until the New Deal. And of course, deficit spending has become a way of life, particularly today. And the New Deal established programs that are still part of American life, such as Social Security, a minimum wage, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, as well as the Security and Exchange Commission. So this is the legacy of the New Deal. So what did the New Deal fail to do? Well, it did not substantially redistribute national income, nor did it challenge the fundamental tenet of capitalism. The New Deal maintained that private ownership would remain as the means of production. So if there was a pattern to New Deal legislation, it could be summed up in one word: security. Job security for workers and farmers. Security to bank deposits. Relief for millions of unemployed people. Reform in banking and in the stock market. Security for homeowners through the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Security to millions of rural folks who now had access to electricity, to schools, to roads. Security to the elderly and unemployed, extending the promise of a secure income. Now, the New Deal also implanted stabilizers to avert future depressions, such as the Security and Exchange Commission and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And it did all of this without fundamentally altering the United States Constitution. Yes, FDR expanded presidential powers so that people now looked not to Congress, but to the president in order to solve the nation's problems. And above all, the New Deal restored people's faith in democracy. During the 1930s, other countries were hit with economic depression, and they opted for a dictatorial form of government to solve economic problems. But in the United States, Roosevelt grappled with those economic problems within a democratic framework. And that is perhaps the greatest achievement of the New Deal. The economy remained capitalistic. And so, in effect, Roosevelt restored confidence in the capitalist system. Okay, so that covers the domestic program of Roosevelt's presidency. And now let us turn to foreign policy. US policy in the Western Hemisphere had been characterized by American intervention in the Caribbean and in South America. So this is a map showing where the United States sent Marines to interfere in the affairs of Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Venezuela. This is before the Roosevelt presidency. Theodore Roosevelt pronounced the Roosevelt Corollary, which stated that the United States would act as the international policeman in the Western Hemisphere, and that the United States has the right to intervene in the affairs of any country in Central or South America. And this policy of intervention, as you could imagine, angered people in Latin America. And this is the way they conceived of Uncle Sam, the United States intervening on behalf of American business interests, United Fruit, for example. And so when Roosevelt was elected president, he wanted to improve relations with Latin America. And so he adopted what he called the good neighbor policy. And what this meant was that he would renounce the Roosevelt Corollary, which insisted that the United States had the right to intervene in Latin America. Roosevelt also withdrew American troops from Haiti and the Dominican Republic, as well as Nicaragua. And he worked to improve relations with Latin American countries. But the goal of extending American influence over Latin America had really not changed. Only the tactics had changed. Even under FDR, the United States continued to support dictators such as Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and in the picture in the middle, Anastas Somoza in Nicaragua. And when a revolution in 1933 threatened US interests in Cuba, the United States supported a coup in order to bring Fulgencio Batista to power. And this is Batista in the lower right. So the United States continued to support Latin American dictators as long as those dictators protected American business interests. On the other hand, the United States gave up its right to intervene in Cuba by getting rid of the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment was enacted after the Spanish-American War, and it asserted that the United States had the right to interfere in Cuba. Well, FDR got Congress to get rid or abrogate the Platt Amendment. And in 1934, the United States ended its financial control over the Dominican Republic. So these were measures taken to improve relations with Latin America. And with the growing threat of Nazi Germany, Roosevelt felt it was even more important to improve those relations with Latin America to prevent those countries from supporting Nazi Germany. And so in 1939, Roosevelt, in the Declaration of Panama, warned European nations to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Particularly, it was a warning directed at Nazi Germany. And then at the Havana Conference of 1940, all the nations of Latin America got together to agree that any attack by a nation outside of the Americas would be considered an attack on all countries in North and South America. Again, this was directed at Nazi Germany. But despite the good neighbor policy and the threat of World War II, Argentina was the one country in Latin America that sympathized with the Nazis. In 1938, Mexico expropriated oil fields owned by US businessmen. Now, when this type of thing happened in the past, that is, when a Latin American government seized American companies, the United States used that as a justification to send in the Marines. But this time, in 1938, Roosevelt did not send in the Marines, as had been done in the past. Instead, he opened negotiations with Mexico, and the Mexican government compensated the US companies for their lost property. And so that was resolved amiably. Now, throughout the 1930s, the mood in the United States was strictly isolationist. That is, Americans wanted to stay out of European affairs. America in the 1930s was more isolationist than it was in the 1920s. And the reasons for this isolationist sentiment are the following. Americans were very disillusioned after World War I. President Woodrow Wilson had told the American people when America entered World War I that the United States was fighting a war to end all wars, a war that would make the world safe for democracy. But after more than 50,000 American troops died on the Western Front, after World War I, the world was still not safe for democracy. The harsh peace treaties only sowed the seeds for yet another world war. And so many Americans felt that it was a mistake for the United States to get involved in World War I, and that we should be determined to stay out of any future European conflicts. Another reason for isolationist sentiment was that the countries we loaned money to during World War I failed to repay that war debt. The war had so devastated our allies that they couldn't repay the war debt. In fact, the only country that did was Finland. And so because countries failed to repay the war debt, many Americans felt, again, that we should have nothing more to do with Europe. And of course, the economic depression of the 1930s dampened any urge to accept overseas responsibilities. In fact, in 1934, a Senate committee called the Nye Committee concluded that the reason the United States got into World War I was because it was a conspiracy of bankers and munition makers that wanted to get us into the war. And these munition makers were referred to as merchants of death. Another reason for isolationist sentiment had to do with geography. We felt secure, insulated from world problems. We were guarded by the Atlantic Ocean on the west, the Pacific on the east, and the Pacific Ocean on the west, and friendly and relatively weak neighbors to our north and south. And so, as the novelist John Dos Passos wrote, the rejection of Europe is what America is all about. And evidence of this isolationist sentiment was seen everywhere. It was widespread through all elements of society, rich and poor, Democrat and Republican. They were all isolationists. Liberals were isolationists, as were conservatives. Henry Ford was an isolationist, as was the socialist Norman Thomas. The American Legion was isolationist. Former President Herbert Hoover was an isolationist. And so during the 1930s, complete attention was being paid on trying to recover from the Depression, not on international issues. Some of the key supporters of New Deal legislation were isolationists, such as Senator William Borah of Idaho, and Gerald Nye of North Dakota, and Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. Other evidence of isolationist sentiment, the United States never joined the League of Nations or the World Court. And there were immigration restrictions throughout the 1930s. And the United States built high tariffs to keep foreign products out. And FDR himself was an isolationist, at least early on. In the 1932 presidential campaign, he renounced his earlier support for American participation in the League of Nations. In 1933, he withdrew US participation in an international economic conference in London. And after his inauguration, FDR decided to shrink the already skeletal American army of then 140,000 men. General Douglas MacArthur was so upset, he told the president that when we lose the next war, an American boy lying in the mud with an enemy's bayonet through his belly and an enemy's foot on his dying throat would spit out his last curse. And I want that name not to be MacArthur, but to be Roosevelt. So at least in the Army, there was opposition to isolationist sentiment. But for most Americans, the feeling was that Europe is going to hell in a handbasket and we should just stay out of it. When Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, he didn't think he had anything to fear from the United States. In fact, Hitler had contempt for American democracy and for the multicultural American society. And Hitler regarded the continuing depression in the United States as proof of America's decline. He saw the panic resulting from the Orson Welles 1938 radio hoax as further evidence of the low intelligence of the American people. And when he watched the film, The Grapes of Wrath, he concluded that the United States would remain a poor and destitute country. Now, war clouds grew increasingly in Europe throughout the 1930s. But as it seemed more likely that Europe was going to go to war, American isolationism also increased. Congress and the American people were determined to repudiate anything that smacked of international engagement. And they were particularly determined to keep America out of any future war, no matter how terrible the threat posed by Hitler's Nazi Germany. But Roosevelt began to believe that the United States had to actively oppose dictators in Germany, Italy, and Japan in order to prevent a future war. And so there was a growing conflict between Roosevelt's internationalist convictions and Congress's isolationism. And that conflict between the president and Congress over foreign policy led to a stalemate. Roosevelt was alarmed over Germany's rearmament, over Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, over Japan's designs on China. But he was reluctant to veer far from isolationism because he needed support for his New Deal program. So this cartoon shows the prevailing sentiment in the United States during the 1930s. It shows war clouds developing in Europe, and it shows Uncle Sam looking over at Europe while the figure of democracy says, stay out for my sake as well as your own. In 1935, Italy attacked Ethiopia. And when that happened, here's a map showing the Japanese attack in China in 1931. And when Italy attacked Ethiopia in 1935, Congress passed a Neutrality Act to keep America out of any foreign war. And so this, what became known as the first Neutrality Act, imposed an embargo of war material to all belligerents. Now, a belligerent is a nation at war. So when Italy attacked the African nation of Ethiopia, the Neutrality Act stated that the United States will not send any war material to either Italy or Ethiopia. So when the term belligerent is used, it doesn't imply the country that started the war. It means countries who are at war, even if you're a victim of the war. And this Neutrality Act also warned Americans not to travel on ships of belligerents. Now, the reason for that harkens back to the Lusitania, which was a British ship in 1915 that was sunk by a German submarine, and 128 Americans were on that ship. And that resulted in demands that America should go to war against Germany. So to prevent something like that from happening again, the Neutrality Act of 1935 warned Americans not to travel on ships of belligerents. And then in 1936, a civil war broke out in Spain between Republican forces and the fascist forces of Francisco Franco. And so in response to the Spanish Civil War, Congress passed a second Neutrality Act. And in this second Neutrality Act, it called for no loans to belligerents. So now the United States could not loan money to any nation that was at war. And again, this harkens back to the World War I experience, when we did loan money to nations at war and they couldn't repay those loans. And then in 1937, after Japan invaded the mainland of China, Congress passed the third Neutrality Act. And this Neutrality Act of 1937 prohibited Americans from traveling on belligerent ships. So the 1935 Act simply warned Americans, but now Americans were prohibited from traveling on belligerent ships. Also, the Neutrality Act said that belligerents could purchase non-material goods, but they had to do it on a cash and carry basis. In other words, that they had to pay in cash and they had to carry the goods back on their own ships. And the Neutrality Act of 1937 prohibited the arming of American merchant ships. So here in this cartoon, we see Europe aflame, Europe at war, and Congress explaining to Roosevelt that the Neutrality Act of 1937 will keep America out of the growing European conflict. Well, strictly speaking, this Neutrality Act of 1937 really didn't apply to what was happening in Asia, because neither Japan nor China issued a formal declaration of war. And so because of that, the United States continued to sell scrap metal and oil to Japan, which ironically provided assistance for the Japanese aggression in China. Now, the effect of this neutrality legislation was that it gave Americans a false sense of security, that we could be insulated from the world crisis, while at the same time, these neutrality acts emboldened aggressor countries because they felt they had nothing to fear from the United States. In October of 1935, in Chicago, Roosevelt called for an international quarantine of aggressor nations. And he said, when an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, that sounds rather timely, the community approves and joins in the quarantine of patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. So he was calling for countries of the world to quarantine aggressive nations. That is, not to trade with them, not to support them. So he was calling on the nations of the world to act against Germany, Italy, and Japan. But he said this in 1937, when the political climate in the United States was strongly isolationist. And this quarantine speech led some isolationist congressmen to threaten the president with impeachment. And so he backed off. As a consequence, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, concluded that Britain could never count on American support, and therefore Britain must appease Nazi Germany. Then in December of 1937, Japanese planes sunk an American gunboat on the Yangtze River in China. It was called the PANAY, and the Japanese attack killed 2 American sailors and wounded 30. Now, Roosevelt didn't want to antagonize the isolationists, and so he accepted Japan's apology for this incident. The strength of the peace at any price feeling in Congress was again reflected in the Ludlow Amendment. This was an amendment that was proposed that would require a nationwide referendum on a declaration of war. Now, the Constitution says that only Congress could declare war, but there was such a fear that the United States would stumble into war that the Ludlow Amendment wanted to take the power to declare war away from Congress and to make it a national referendum. Now, this amendment was barely defeated in the House of Representatives. It was defeated by a vote of 209 to 188. Now, 10 votes made the difference. And if 10 of those representatives had voted in favor of the Ludlow Amendment, then that would have deprived the President and Congress of any control over foreign policy. Now, in response to Nazi aggression, In 1933, Hitler came to power. By 1934, Germany began to rearm. In 1938, Germany moved troops into Austria, and Germany united with Austria. The union of Germany and Austria was known as Anschluss. Then in 1939, Germany occupied Czechoslovakia. And in September of 1939, Germany invaded its eastern neighbor, Poland, and World War II began. Now, in light of these events, Roosevelt urged Congress to revise the Neutrality Acts, but Congress refused. When war broke out in September of 1939, a Gallup poll found that 84% of Americans favored the British and the French. Only 2% favored Nazi Germany. Yet, most people still felt that we should stay out of the war. The strength of the US Army in 1939 was about 175,000. 18 other countries had more soldiers than the United States had in 1939. In 1939, the American Army was just slightly larger than the Army of Bulgaria. And that's because of isolationist sentiment. The America First Committee, led by Charles Lindbergh, was the foremost non-interventionist pressure group working to prevent the United States from entering World War II. American First Movement had some 800,000 members, and Lindbergh made several impassioned radio addresses against revising neutrality legislation. He had visited Germany several times in the 1930s. He had even been decorated by the Nazi government. In May of 1940, FDR told Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau, "If I should die tomorrow, I want you to know this. I am absolutely convinced that Lindbergh is a Nazi." Well, whether Lindbergh was a Nazi or not, he was certainly sympathetic to Nazi Germany. Another personality who was sympathetic to Nazi Germany was the American ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph Kennedy, the father of the future President Kennedy. As ambassador to England, Kennedy predicted that Britain would be defeated by Nazi Germany, and so he urged Roosevelt to come to some kind of accommodation with Hitler. One British diplomat called Joe Kennedy a very poor specimen of a double-crosser and a defeatist. Roosevelt said, quote, "Joe Kennedy has been an appeaser and will always be an appeaser. He's just a pain in the neck to me." Now, the existing Neutrality Act of 1937 prevented the United States from helping any nation that was opposed to Hitler. Under the terms of that act, other countries could not buy a single bullet from the United States. Now, although the United States, and by the way, here's the cartoon of those who wanted the United States to help European nations victimized by Nazi Germany. But the cartoon shows Uncle Sam as a Gulliver giant being tied down by isolationist sentiment. And these isolationist figures are labeled appeasers, isolationists, businessmen, defeatists, Nazi sympathizers, the hate England crowd. Now, although the United States was officially neutral when World War II began in 1939, there was no doubt that the majority of American people favored the British and the French. And so the question was, how much was the United States prepared to assist Britain and France. In his State of the Union address in January of 1939, Roosevelt campaigned for a revision of the neutrality laws. At the very least, he wanted to make armaments available to the Allies to help them counter the military advantage that Nazi Germany had. And so he asked Congress to lift the arms embargo. In September of 1939, Congress passed the Fourth Neutrality Act, which allowed belligerents to purchase war material on a cash and carry basis. So now Britain and France could purchase war material from the United States if they paid in cash and carried it on their own ships. Now, during the early months of World War II, most Americans were confident that the Allies would win, but those hopes were dashed in the spring and summer of 1940, when a series of rapid offensives by Nazi Germany led to the conquest of Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and Holland. And in May, Churchill replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister. And in June of 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany. Great Britain now stood alone against the full might of the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. So how did Americans react to these horrific developments in 1940? Well, before this, most Americans felt that a German victory in the war would not represent a threat to the United States. And so here's a cartoon that shows Great Britain in the form of John Bull asking Roosevelt to come over and help Britain against Nazi Germany. And so the British figure says, "Frankie, ain't you coming over?" And Roosevelt is imprisoned by US sentiment. And he says, "No, darn it, I can't get out." So Roosevelt wanted to help Britain. He was desperate to help Britain, but US sentiment was still isolationist. But by July 1940, 66% of the American public began to believe that now Germany did pose a threat to the United States. And so in the summer of 1940, Congress approved $18 billion for military preparedness. By the summer of 1940, three positions seemed to develop. There were those who wanted to aid Britain and France, such as Roosevelt, but to aid them without direct American participation in the war. A second position was there were some that wanted to immediately declare war on Germany. And the third position was the isolationist position. Now, during the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, it seemed that a German invasion of England was likely. And that came as a shock to the American people. And they wondered, what if Germany won the war? Would the United States be next? What if the Germans were able to gain control of the British Navy? Would the US economy be successful in competing with a German-dominated world? These are the questions that haunted Roosevelt and his advisors. And in September of 1940, Roosevelt signed an executive agreement to give 50 overaged destroyers to Britain in exchange for military bases in Newfoundland and Bermuda. It was called the Destroyer for Bases deal. And it was an executive order, so it did not need congressional approval. Now, this was a clear violation of neutrality. The United States was officially neutral, but here we were giving 50 warships to Britain. But Roosevelt was convinced that American security depended on Britain standing up to Nazi Germany. And in the same month of September 1940, Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime draft in American history. More than 16 million men between the ages of 21 and 35 were now registered on the draft rolls. In the 1940 election, Roosevelt decided to run for a third term, and that shattered the tradition of only running for 2 terms. In the campaign, both Roosevelt and his Republican opponent, Wendell Willkie, promised to keep the United States out of the war, yet both promised to aid Britain and France. In early December of 1940, only a few weeks after Roosevelt had been reelected to a third term, Prime Minister Winston Churchill warned Roosevelt that Britain could not afford to purchase arms from the United States, that Britain was on the verge of defeat. 2/3 of Americans polled thought that Britain would not survive. General George C. Marshall thought that Britain would lose the war. And so Roosevelt's response to Churchill's appeal was Lend-Lease, that the United States would lend or lease military equipment to Great Britain. And after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, American Lend-Lease aid was also extended to Stalin's Russia. And so the United States became the arsenal of democracy, producing weapons that were loaned or leased to Britain and the Soviet Union fighting Nazi Germany. Roosevelt explained to the American people that it was like a homeowner whose neighbor's house was on fire. He said it would be in the interest of a homeowner to lend his neighbor a garden hose to help the neighbor fight the fire so that the flames would not engulf the entire neighborhood. And so that's what the United States was doing. Even though the United States was neutral, we are aiding the countries fighting Nazi Germany to prevent Nazi Germany from conquering the world. So this Lend-Lease Act sparked a massive political debate, both in Congress and throughout the country at large. In the end, it passed both houses of Congress by a wide majority. And the Lend-Lease Act signified a decided shift away from isolationism and a new definition of American neutrality. We would still stay out of the war. We would not send American soldiers to fight, but we were not strictly neutral. And it was clear that the recipients of Lend-Lease aid would be Britain and the Soviet Union, not Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, I'm not going to discuss Roosevelt's leadership during World War II, because that is a topic for another lecture series. As the decade of the 1930s came to an end, the nation looked to the future. And so New York hosted the World's Fair of 1939 in Flushing Meadows, Queens. Some 25 million people visited. The major exhibit was called The World of Tomorrow, ranging from ingenious industrial exhibits to an amusement area to international pavilions. The theme of the New York World's Fair, ironically, was international harmony. But before the end of its first season, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and then World War II began. When the World's Fair reopened in the spring of 1940, the Polish pavilion was gone because Poland disappeared from the map. The Czech pavilion was removed by 1940, because Czechoslovakia was no longer an independent nation. And by the end of May of 1940, the flag at the French pavilion was lowered to half-mast as the Nazis occupied France. So by then, it had become obvious that the shining image of international harmony projected by the World's Fair bore no relation to reality. And with good reason, people began to fear the world of tomorrow. And so the 1939 World's Fair serves as a coda to the end of the 1930s. Now, while Roosevelt's New Deal aimed to bring about relief, reform, and recovery, it only succeeded in bringing about relief and reform. Recovery was not achieved by New Deal programs in the 1930s. Rather, the United States fully recovered from the Depression only because of World War II. And so when we look at this chart of unemployment in the 1930s, you can see that at the height of the Depression in 1933, there was some 12 million unemployed. But once World War II began, and once American industries geared up for war, and once America entered the war, unemployment in the United States fell off dramatically, so that by 1942, there was only 1 million unemployed, and by the end of the war, there were virtually no people out of work in America. Now, I want to finish this four-part lecture on the Great Depression by talking about how historians evaluate the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Periodically, historians are asked to rank presidents of the United States in one of 5 categories: either great, near great, average, below average, or failures. And here are the results of those polls. In 1948, a poll of historians placed Roosevelt as the 3rd greatest president of the United States, just behind Lincoln and Washington. And then the next poll showed that Roosevelt maintained his position in 3rd place. And then again, he improved his position as the 2nd greatest president of the United States, even greater than George Washington. And in 2000, he maintained that 2nd place position. So the question is, why have historians rated Roosevelt as such a great president? Well, the fact is that Franklin D. Roosevelt led the United States through the 2 greatest crises of the 20th century, the Great Depression and World War II. And the United States emerged from those 2 great crises as the world's most powerful and most affluent nation. And for that, Franklin D. Roosevelt deserves most of the credit, according to the historians in these polls. Okay, so that concludes my take on the United States in the Great Depression.